Okay, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. This is a great room. I like this. I feel like I should sing a song or something for you guys. All right, we'll stick to security, positive security for that matter. And I know the program said I'm in from the US, but I actually live in Canada. I'm from Canada, so forgive me in advance for my accent. When I get to presenting, I go back into my roots. So if you can't understand what I'm saying, just ask me afterwards. All right, so I've spent the last 20 years in the security industry, well, the IT industry in particular, and working specifically for the last, say, 15 or so, directly in compliance and security, two areas that tend not to fit together very well, and have been merging over the last few years. And today I want to introduce you to some of the ways of measuring and applying metrics to common security problems and assets across our ecosystems. So in essence, I've spent a long time, and for the last 5 years that I've been with Carbon Black, I've worked on writing policies that will join the two together and apply more real metrics or qualitative metrics that we can actually better see how our security posture fits together. Regardless of what framework or regulatory drivers we're using or anything like that. Basically, when you focus on measuring these security controls and the core security controls from a positive standpoint, it can provide clarity. And what that leads to is reducing liability. And I'm going to talk about things like scorecards, and I'll mention liability a lot, and we'll look at some frameworks and policies and this and that. And at the end of the day, what we're doing is drilling down into the core security controls that really matter, and will give us that context to figure. Guys are a tough crowd. Anyway, let's carry on here. We're going to look at some of these main controls, or consider the that pertain to risk measure. So I'm going to focus in on some of the common security controls that I spend my lifeblood in and have been for the last 15 years writing compliance policies and all that crazy stuff that compliance people like to do. And I can't sleep at night, and that's what I do. I write compliance policies. And then we'll look at some common security and audit frameworks and scorecarding techniques. So the idea is when you gather all this information, you gather all the wonderful information that that Mark was just talking about when they run their analysis and their attack simulations and whatnot, you get a lot of valuable data. Well, what do you do with that data, and how can you see and measure that as close to real time as possible? So we'll look at some of those areas as well. And then what we're calling the cybersecurity scorecarding methodology or recipe. And we'll look at that. It's an alternate way of presenting a cybersecurity scorecard. So we're trying to make it exciting. So we're going to focus in on some of the common critical security controls that mean the most to your industry, i.e. the ones that you are dealing with on a daily basis, but more importantly, the ones that you are held to when it comes down to an audit, a security audit, or perhaps, hopefully not, a breach or some kind of compelling security event. These are the ones that you have to have data on. And if you don't, there's consequences. And then we'll look at the risk maturity model. And then last but not least, we'll look at the control focus, well, basically from a positive approach. And I'll explain what I mean by that as I go through the presentation. All right, so I've already told you where I come from, a little bit more about me. I've been working in security and compliance for a long time now, and drifted across the industry in many different companies and whatnot, that sort of building up my toolbox of compliance policy and security. Enough on me. And I also play the drums. That's what I do. I really wanted to do that today, but they wouldn't let me. All right. So no matter who you are in the organization, right, whether you're a board member, whether you're the CISO, or whether you're an analyst or a manager of a security department, you all have regulations that affect you. Now, as you go up in the regulation, and there's a lot of talk these days on why the board cares about cybersecurity. I have talked with more C-level folks, CISOs, CEOs, CFOs, CXOs across the industry than I ever have before in the last couple of years. And what they want to know about is, are those critical security controls what everyone is saying they are? Because I can't sleep at night if they're not. Because they have a ton of regulations that they're responsible for, and their liability increases as those regulations become more strict and more frequent. Every time there's a security incident, of course, there's a new regulation to back that up. There's a new data security regulation, or there's a new policy, or some kind of industry vertical regulation that's introduced, or perhaps made to be more strict, that then we have to answer to. And of course, the industry is not, there's a lot going on. There's a lot we face. Our threatscape is increasing. It's crazy. There's I have to update this slide. Actually, I have to update it now. A whole bunch of things have happened since the last time I presented this slide, which was 2 weeks ago. So we have a very active threatscape that we need to be aware of and on top of. And also, since we're talking about policy and regulation and measuring controls, there's a shifting sands of policies, right? We've had some shifting sands going on recently with the UK and different data security standards, general data security regulation may change for the UK because the shifting sands of what's happening with the country versus the rest of the world, policies that are out there, regulations, everything else that we are responsible for and that we use to measure our cybersecurity posture and the health posture of our organization as a whole. Now, we're also responsible for all these different industry and, well, right across our entire ecosystem of our organizations. No matter where we work, we have some kind of regulation that's going to be applying pressure to us. And we have challenges. We need to try to unite all those regulatory silos with the information that we're gathering. And that's no easy task. As well, we need to make everyone work faster, and we may need to make sure that we're improving adoption. So definitely, no matter where we are in the industry, no matter what vertical we're under, definitely a lot of areas and challenges from that perspective. Obviously, technology investments, we want to be able to make proper use of those. And if we don't, there's a lot of consequences. And we know this. We see this in the press every day. There's something happening constantly across the industry where we're reading of various consequences. Now, there's more distractions. There's things that happen in our market that cause distractions. Just the Windows distractions, Windows family distractions of going end of support is becoming insane recently. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who are facing operating systems that are going out of support. And then they're trying to measure those operating systems. Well, there's got to be a way that we can harness all of that, including any of these distractions that pop up. Now, the technology that we're working with and collecting data from is getting insane as well. So we all know, working in the industry, that there's 1,000,001 different metrics that we could gather and try to measure, or attempt to measure. And that technology is spanned across our organizations and is speaking different languages as well. So we need to find some way to consolidate that, probably via a policy and or a framework, in order to measure it effectively. So we're here, and we got to move forward. So cybersecurity or IT scorecarding. It's been around for a long time. It's been around since businesses were measured. And it's evolving into more of a popular way of measuring security posture. So the idea, though, at the end of the day, is making sense of information, presenting it in an easy way or a consumable way. Usually scorecards are used for top-level management. The CFO or board member or the steering committee, they don't really want to see a technical readout of all your log reports from every event that you collected from your SIM server on a particular day. They don't really care about that. They should maybe, but they don't. They just want to make sure that they're not liable. They want to cover their behind. So at the end of the day, the scorecarding in and of itself, there's many different reasons why we're going to do it, but when we boil it down, really it's to reduce liability. Provide security assurance, not insurance, because really this is what we've been working on. Insurance is reactive. Assurance is proactive, and that's what we want to aim towards. Right, so this is 101, cybersecurity or IT security scorecarding 101. We need to understand our business objectives, basically what our risks are. We need to look at our business practices and say, what's at risk if I do this or this? And then our security objectives. We need to say, well, do we even have a security policy? And what are the risks of that policy if one of those controls fail? We need to understand, obviously, our stakeholders. And this, again, is if you look, if anybody's been through CISSP or any of those, or a CISA or anything like that, this is common audit methodology. RACI document, basically, who's responsible for this? Who's going to be accountable? Who do I consult? And who's going to inform me on the results of those, of the metrics that I get? As well, who are my sponsors? Really, who's going to pay for this? I often find that I'm talking to sponsors. Being at a security vendor, I will often be put in front of the sponsor to build the business case. Then we need to apply a framework. We have to apply some kind of framework. I don't think there's any way in this day and age that we can avoid working with frameworks now. And that could be as simple as just a standard framework to measure 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 different metrics, and you're done. But somehow, some way, we have to apply a framework, and there's millions of them. Now, then we can start to enforce our framework via a policy. So once we've determined what framework we're using, that's going to dictate how we're collecting things. Then now that we're collecting things, we need to have a policy. Most of us do. As we looked at the other slide before with the pillars, there's many different types of policies. It might be regulatory, it might be internal policy, maybe your security policy. We need some way to enforce that framework at the end of the day. Then we collect the data based on our policy, and then we look for gaps. We report on our critical security stance, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so again, 101 IT scorecarding technology. Now, from our standpoint at Carbon Black, the way we present this and work with this is basically a three-stage recipe. So take framework, put it in place, apply it to a policy, could be anything, and then focus on the security controls. And there's various security controls that are present in every single policy that you can look at. I've studied different regulatory policies over the last almost 15 years. Every time I'm writing policies and actions, routines to collect information for those policies, I find the same controls. I always find classification and categorization in every single policy that there is. So there's a common set of controls that we can use to measure our cybersecurity stance when we're looking at true cybersecurity score from an organizational perspective. Now, there's also a ton of policies. We have many. And most organizations, does anybody have a policy they're held to? Hands? Really? Okay. You got to do your taxes every year, right? Because if you don't, anyway. The thing is, there's tons of policies, and it's very easy to take a policy and use it as a baseline. There's a lot of common industry policies that people will use to set a baseline in order to measure their cybersecurity stance. And that's what I'm getting at here is you can pick any one of them. I was a QSA more recently before I joined Carbon Black. And with that, I was working particularly with the payment card industry and doing audits against folks that were held to PCI DSS. And I found that was used as a baseline, very easily used as a baseline because it's very prescriptive and it has all those same security controls that we talked about. There's a few other ones. If you look at ISO standards, ISO will measure a lot of the same controls or security controls that we need to know about in order to prove our security posture. And that's an ISO security scorecard representation of that, where they basically give you the threshold to show where you stand in terms of each and every security control that's being measured across the board. ISO is broad, though. There's a lot within that, and I mean, taking that as a full-fledged policy is a large undertaking. Also, we measure our cybersecurity risk tolerance, and this is another thing that I find sometimes doesn't happen when we're measuring specific security controls, is people will get all drawn up in the policy and just say, am I getting a check mark for that policy? But do they really know if that policy is at risk? And how do they know that? And that's where we're going to apply positive controls, and I'll show you that in a second. All right. There's many others. There's NIST, CFS, Cybersecurity Framework, as well, which will give you a sense of risk across the various security controls that you're working on, and so on and so forth. It focuses on the same type of steps, same type of controls that we would need to use in order to prove cybersecurity stance. FFIECs, one other one. This one's interesting because this was the first one where I saw that they applied risk to a great degree. FFIEC was essentially put together for banks, basically a risk maturity model to build a true representation of where an organization stood in terms of maturity, but maturity against security, but also exposure to risk. And to do this, I'll skip this one and go to this next one. This explains it here. So it's basically a stepwise, it's something you can step through. You can actually download the document, the Cybersecurity Awareness Tool, and it's an Excel spreadsheet with 1,000,000 questions. Well, not 1,000,000. There's 39 for the risk maturity, and there's 494 for the cybersecurity maturity. So basically, it gives you an idea of where your organization stands. Now, you have to answer the questions honestly, else it's not really going to help you. But at the end of the day, you will get a representation of where you sit in terms of risk maturity. You'll get something that looks like this. Now, it will show you what type of policy your organization is ready for. And I found that the FFIEC, not that I work for them or anything, or they're giving me something on the side, but really it allows us to understand what we can jump into as an organization. So because then we'll know exactly what the maturity of the organization is in terms of risk, but also where we sit in terms of risk to our security controls. That's what it's really measuring. Not how risk, not really, are we at risk of being breached? No, it's measuring, is this security control at risk of not being fulfilled? Is this actually doing what it should be doing? And what's the risk to that if I change something in the organization? So it will take you through all the questionnaires in order to give you that maturity score for both levels. So cybersecurity awareness and then your risk maturity as well. So if you're an organization that's up and innovative and the least risk, well, you know that you're ready to jump into one of the more complex frameworks if you need to. Okay? And it's like any other framework, wash, rinse, repeat, and you go around the circle essentially, okay? All right, so moving on with the cybersecurity scorecarding technique, obviously we need to understand who our stakeholders are, right? And that can be anybody across the organization. And different firms that deal with harnessing information around adoption of security awareness can really help to discover who those stakeholders are. Because this is going to be crucial. These are all the first steps we need to take in order to harness our cybersecurity awareness. Now, the RACI document, again, it's all identification. These are all manual steps that we go through in order to understand who's going to be responsible for this, who's accountable, right? It's usually a long list of people. Who am I going to consult, or who's going to consult me, and then who can inform me on the cybersecurity awareness program. These are all questions that we need to answer before we launch into the cybersecurity scorecarding technique. Obviously, the sponsors are going to, and as I was saying before, these are the ones that will usually have the money. So they're important people to lock down and essentially sell and pitch the idea of getting a scorecard or showing them the results of the scorecard because then they'll let us buy all the good toys that we want in the security realm. Now, we apply a policy. Obviously, we talked about this already. There are many. I'm a big fan, obviously, as you've seen, of PCI and also using the FFIEC to measure between frameworks and then use prescriptive policies. But there are a ton of other ones, and we will find those same common controls across the board when measuring our security awareness program. So we saw this before. The idea, what we want to do here is the benefits of then applying the framework and the policy and then building out a cybersecurity scorecard from a positive technique, a positive perspective, is we're going to unite all these silos. Hopefully, everybody will know what everybody is doing, right? The left hand will know what the right hand is doing, hopefully. Reduce administration and streamline our existing infrastructure. That's what we want to do. So I'll introduce you to the cybersecurity control maturity model. And this is something that I've spent my lifeblood working on for the past 5 years at Carbon Black, and obviously had dealt with in the past as well. The idea is there are certain common controls that are found in every IT audit methodology. Those common controls then can be used to measure more effectively the true stance of our cybersecurity posture. And as we move up the model, we become more mature in our stance or our risk maturity model. So essentially, as we harness each of the controls, starting from conforming our assets or classification and categorization, moving up to enforcing a security and compliance policy, each of those 5 controls will help us gain maturity around our cybersecurity measure. Okay? The idea, what we want to get to is the best level of protection or the best highest rank score from a maturity perspective in terms of risk, right? Because by eliminating risk, we're reducing liability. So there's an inverse relationship between the two. And of course, we want to do this across the ecosystem of our infrastructure, and then as well across the different regulations and policies that we have. All right. So focusing in on those particular security controls. Can't speak now. My accent's getting to me. All right. Categorizing classification. We want to do this as close to real time as possible. Mark mentioned some bits in his presentation talking about going towards real-time identification and how long it takes to find particular anomalies within the testing that's being done. So it's important to do attack simulation and pattern matching and whatnot as often as you can in order to try to harness that data to be able to find anomalies faster within the organization as close to real time as possible. So if something changes, we want to know right away. But then we can also lock down change and control change. So if we don't allow unauthorized change with that control, then we can basically eliminate a lot of the noise that we would have to look at when we're doing our testing and analysis. As well, we want to measure and analyze our risk. Obviously, we want to detect threats, because that's common, and of course that's a control that's found everywhere, as well as actively enforce our policy, all right? So we want to be able to measure against our policy. So what does that look like now with the cybersecurity scorecard technique? Classification, monitor, and I'm going to concentrate on those 5 main controls, and we'll just go through the controls and look at how we can measure those from a positive perspective, okay? So now we're looking at the, wow, it's way up there, it's just in the front, isn't it? Risk and policy maturity model. So as I said, as we move up the model, the steps we take and how we measure those controls will allow us to become more mature in our risk maturity, essentially less risk, and a more mature cybersecurity posture. So 5 controls across the bottom, right? We want to classify targeting our gaps, introduce a framework. Now we can monitor and collect, measure and risk, enforce our policy, start to enforce our policy. We can start to enforce a policy at a very early stage in the game as we're doing the various bits of testing and whatnot. Now, if we get into vulnerability analysis and testing, this is where we can do threat simulation and all those other wonderful techniques to try to determine what the posture is of our cybersecurity controls within our organization. Start to identify the weak spots and understand how our infrastructure reacts to various threats that can be thrown at them. And then, of course, from that, what we derive from that is the ability to detect threats, detect anomalies within our IT infrastructure. And then we're getting into true threat prevention and detection, and also investigating, doing forensics, incident response, and all the way through to remediation, where we can report on that, obviously then allowing our stakeholders to understand what our cybersecurity posture is. Okay? Those are the various steps of the scorecarding methodology within the maturity curve. This is where I would apply them, essentially. And let's look at the controls themselves. So we'll just go through the controls, and then we'll take some questions. I'd say classification. So the way we suggest classifying things is from a positive approach. And Mark was mentioning whitelisting earlier. So that is, that's the positive security baseline to set up what should happen within your infrastructure. Now, whitelisting just doesn't apply to files. It applies to everything, right? There's a lot of network devices that will do forms of whitelisting. There's a lot of next-gen antivirus solutions which will do forms of whitelisting or application control, or it's called many different things. The idea is only allow trusted things to happen. Now, we can derive those trusted policies from many different ways, perhaps through the testing that's being done on our systems. The idea here is to build a profile of what should be happening within our systems. It makes it a lot easier then to deal with an anomaly, because if an anomaly enters the system, basically it's unauthorized. It won't be able to do anything, so hence we don't have to deal with it. But we'll report on it, we'll audit it, we'll show our IT organization and our auditors that we caught it and we can deal with it. But essentially, it eliminates, again, a lot of the noise we have to deal with. And we can dial that policy up and down to make it more stringent if need be, or if the regulatory policy that's upon us becomes more strict. Now, the second one is around controlling the integrity of our assets. A lot of people, when I say that, will think of file integrity monitoring. So the ability to prove that things are what they are. Now, positive security has a benefit to file integrity monitoring or any other type of asset integrity monitoring as well, because it will set up what should be happening. So unauthorized stuff can't do anything. So if there's an unauthorized change, this is about controlling change. If there's an unauthorized change, it can't happen. So once you eliminate unauthorized change, you have a lot less to monitor. So the idea here is when you're collecting the metrics on what you're going to report on, there's a lot less to collect. Okay? So eliminate the noise or reduce the noise. Now our threat intel, we have a ton of it. The idea is we want to start accumulating that threat intelligence, work across different real-time feeds or threat intelligence or testing efforts that have been done, threat research and whatnot. Again, referring back to Mark's presentation, there's a lot of testing that's being done across a lot of shared information that, say, Context would do to determine with different clients on what will work and what won't work, things they've seen before. We want to make use of that from a positive standpoint within a trust policy so that we already know when we build the policy together via our trust policy engine that we're pulling in a lot of that shared data, mixing it together. All right, detecting threats. Again, the trust policy applies to this more than any other. Because again, if something is unauthorized and not supposed to introduce change into my environment, then it shouldn't. If I have a proper trust policy in place, I can stop unauthorized change. It's that simple, right? That's where the trust policy comes into play. So now that gives me proactive analysis of risk. So I can actually see if something is looking like an anomaly or a possibility. I'm mixing together negative and positive security here. I'm using all the heuristics, all the behavioral analytics that are running across all the different solutions that are found in the industry today, as well as indicators of compromise and everything else. Again, all the testing that's being done on my networks, all the attack simulations and whatnot, the results of all of that. I'm mixing that all in with the positive trust policy in order to make sure that what I'm reporting is what it is. So basically, if I do an enforcement, the enforcement is true and sound, and I can prove that back to my auditors so that my cybersecurity policy is of the utmost being enforced across the board. All right, and then the last one, and you saw the kill chain before, this is just a different representation of it, is that I want to enforce that policy right across the kill chain. And the way that I found that it's most effective to do this with is to use a policy or a regulatory policy or a framework. Sometimes they sort of merge together, and I know that a lot of people say to me, wait a second, you mean a framework or policy? Well, they kind of, sometimes they can be used for both. PCI is a good example of that. But the idea is right across every stage of the kill chain, we need to ensure that we are enforcing the security controls that we've been measuring. We just talked about 6 or 5 of them. There is really 6 in there, but anyway, I'll give somebody a prize if they find where that 6th one is. That's it. Anyway, so carrying on here, real-time against the framework, automatically educating the end users on what the policy is. Because again, the weakest link in the chain is where things are going to break. So we have to make sure that from a security awareness perspective, that we can enforce the policy but also educate on the policy to all of those stakeholders. And that's why we went through the entire process of identifying all those bits and pieces of the IT cybersecurity scorecard. Okay, so let's apply PCI to, since I love PCI so much, if you can't tell, we'll apply it to the cybersecurity kill chain. So each of the controls that are in something like PCI, each of the steps that you would go through if you're doing a CBEST. Now I know it's around vulnerability testing, but a lot of the steps that you would take are there for a reason. They have specific pieces of the kill chain that they're responsible for, that the tests will be targeted against. So the same goes with a prescriptive regulation like PCI. It can be used as a baseline to ensure that each of the controls that are put there for a reason are being enforced across the kill chain. So if you can prove enforcement of all of those controls and you can get a positive result back from each of those, you know that you're covering the entire kill chain. So you can take the controls from PCI as we've done here and apply those to each stage of the cybersecurity kill chain. Okay. And then there's various other opportunities we have to solve specific problems that we have in the industry. And I mentioned a slide before around distractions in the industry. So there are various ways that we can sort of beef up our cybersecurity policy and controls that are responsible for each phase of my cybersecurity ecosystem. All right, and then we want to measure that. Again, there's many different ways to represent this, and these are just some examples of representations on scorecards, just for you to see. Again, there's different ways that you can mix this together. People like to look at it in different ways. But again, from a standpoint of maybe you're looking at a board member or the CEO or somebody like that, they don't want to see, again, huge detailed reports of number of vulnerabilities per this month and the trend and everything else. They will want to see exactly where they stand from a risk management standpoint, from a liability standpoint, and metrics around security controls that really mean something to them to allow them to sleep at night. There's one that's using the critical controls via NIST cybersecurity framework, and that takes all the controls that we talked about, and then we'll build in your maturity model with that in order for you to see exactly where you sit with each of those controls. And collect the information from a positive security standpoint will help me do that for each of those controls that we talked about. So at the end of the day, now you probably don't want to give this chart. This is good for my security analysts. They like this one. It's a heat map essentially, which would allow me to see anomalies within my system across all of those controls, measuring them all together, right? But the results of that heat map may be something that you want to give to your senior officials in the organization who really want to see what the cybersecurity stance is of the organization. This is an example of a cybersecurity scorecard, which we've been sort of putting together and building. And obviously, I didn't have time today to drill into that and show you how we do that. But essentially, at the end of the day, you can get the answers on what areas you really need to drill into. And if you're seeing all green like that and there's only one yellow, you're going to have happy executives at that point. But again, the idea is to give them something very simple, very digestible, to show the true stance of those most important critical security controls that really report on the cybersecurity stance of my organization. All right. With that, any questions at all?
I liked the second to last slide where you showed our status and the status of our peers. That's one of the questions I've constantly been asked is how do we compare to our peers? Where did you get that sort of data from? Because quite often people are very nervous about contributing to peer type comparisons.
Yeah, so over the last, let's say 3-4 years, there's been a lot of work to join together various industries. So we've collected a lot of data from the shared threat information that's being formulated. A lot of that was derived from the banking industry, so the financial ISAC, which is shared threat information. It's available to everyone. So the community is gradually opening up, but that's a good point because you have to sometimes take a lot of that data with a grain of salt when you're comparing to, well, what's my stance in terms of all my friends that are in the same industry? Because that data is just starting to mature, I would say, from my opinion. But that's where I derived that from.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.